Laoise de Brún, welcome to the Iconoclast one-to-one interview.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And today we are going to talk about a very urgent topic, something that is really coming at us hard and fast, which is this gender ideology and what's happening in society. So you set up the Countess. Can you tell us a bit about what is the Countess and what is its aims?
So we are an organisation, we're fully incorporated, we're single issue, and we highlight the impact of gender self-ID and gender ideology, or you can just call it trans ideology, on women, children and vulnerable young people, particularly LGBT young people, but all of society. We view this very much as a radical reordering of society that no one voted for, that we didn't consent to and we weren't consulted on. We have identified 8 pillars of concern, which we see as the areas of life that self-ID and gender ideology impact. And those are prisons, sport, language legislation, the transitioning of young people, and lesbian erasure. So we look at these, we look at practice and policy around these areas, and we have working groups behind each of these pillars with the relevant expertise. So for instance, schools and safeguarding will have 2 heads. One is the practical implications of if a boy says, I'm a girl, and demands to use the girls' toilets. And I can tell you that is already happening in Irish schools. There's a school in the Midlands where there is a boy who wears the girls' uniform and is being allowed to use the girls' toilets. So this is happening on the ground in Ireland. You know, when we started our work, I do feel it was probably felt a bit abstract for people. And, you know, the only real concrete example that we could offer was the fact that there were men in the women's wing in Limerick prison. Now, I still feel very strongly about that. It is unconscionable that the most vulnerable women in prison, you know, if you look at the data globally, and the same is true of the population in Ireland, you're looking at 95% of these women who are non-violent offenders. They're in prison for, you know, crimes of poverty, crimes of addiction. They're victims of coercive control and abusive relationships. A huge majority of them are victims of child sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and they're in prison. And now we have locked up the men that, you know, a moment ago in our society, those same men were kept away from women because, you know, rapists, for instance, or paedophiles were kept away from women and they were put in their own prison because they were so dangerous. Now, in the upside down, as I call it, we're putting those men in the women's jail. And this is happening not just in Ireland, but in all jurisdictions where they've brought in self-ID. And I do feel, in retrospect, it's done on purpose in prisons first because it's a testing ground. And sadly, it's sad to say that, you know, a lot of people in society don't care about those women. So therefore, they're able to like normalise it.
Well, there's almost a sense of, well, you know, they've done something wrong, they're in there, whatever happens.
And they're tough enough to deal with it or whatever, yeah. So, but I think that was done on purpose. I do feel that was the first encroachment in society to test the ground. Like, what will society do? Will they erupt in protest? Will they say, this is wrong, not in my name? Or will they just walk on by?
So just the whole self-ID.
Yes.
So this came from 2015.
Yes.
This was an act that was passed.
Yeah.
And it just simply allowed somebody to, just claim to be the opposite sex?
I think people are starting to grasp this, but I mean, when you say it out loud, it's so shocking. So in the past, there was always a tiny population, like a tiny population, like 0.001% of typically young boys who had severe distress from around their sex bodies, and they were often proto-gay, like ultra, you know, very feminine. They became feminine proto-gay men, and they had full genital surgery, and they identified as female. That population still exists, but the modern day trans movement has really nothing to do with them. The modern day trans movement is essentially a men's rights movement, a men's sexual rights movement. And at the forefront, or the meaning of it in terms of its theoretical framework, is that any man at any moment, if he wants to, can identify as a woman and get access to female-only spaces. And there is no need to transition. So bringing that back to Ireland, what happened in Ireland was there was a test case, the Foy case, where a man, in fact, had full genital surgery and he wanted to have his birth cert changed. Now, he had, in fact, managed to get other legal documents changed, but he wanted his birth cert changed, and he actually failed at first instance. And the judgment is extraordinary. You know, I read it and it gives me kind of, for any activist, you know, it's a lovely judgment to read, but it's also prescient, because what the judge says, Ketchney J, he says, one's birth cert is not a document that shows one's travels through life. He also says it's in the interest of the state not to falsify these records, to keep accurate birth records. And he wonders about the impact on women and children. And it's important to note as well that you won't ever hear this and you won't read this in the newspaper, but Lydia Foy's family were against his application. They contested it. But the narrative is in Ireland that, you know, they had this 20-year battle and finally we had self-ID. That's not quite the real story. There was a test case in Europe which we had to then follow. So the original High Court decision was restated. But that test case was also, like Foy, about privacy, the right to privacy, and also about your name and your marker on your documents. In no place at all in the Goodwin case, which is the English test case, the European test case, they don't mention access to female-only spaces. Like, it's not discussed. No one even considers this. And what happens is the Irish case is restated, and they realise there's a need to legislate. So they do the right thing, and they create a cross-party group of experts. And that group of experts, the review group, the advisory group, they actually advise the medical model. But that's not what we have in Ireland. The medical model means that you have to go before your GP or a panel of doctors and lawyers. It differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but it's an attempt to keep the wrong sorts of men away from this mechanism. However, what we've ended up in Ireland is a law that allows you to change sex for all purposes. It says for all purposes. So we view this in the Countess and our organisation as an access all area pass for predators.
And so what about schools? Because it looks like there's a new RSE curriculum which is teaching this as fact. And we've only got a very short period of time now before this academic year is over, then we're into the summer. So what's going to happen there?
So we have seen some of the textbooks, and I hate to say it's not looking good. I mean, it's not great. You know, some of the textbooks, well, all of them seem to be teaching this ideology as fact, and as you mentioned, and that amounts to indoctrination, because children cannot get up and leave. They cannot decide to be somewhere else. They are a captive audience, a bit like the prison population. But it also contravenes the very robust rights that parents have under Irish law, under the Constitution and under the Education Act. Now, they will say, oh, that you can always pull your child out, you've got an opt-out clause. We would view that very much as just a sop to concerns. And frankly, like, if a child is being taught this as fact and it becomes normative, they will just integrate it. The cohort will just believe this is the truth and this is normal. And even if they're not in that class, they will still hear about it, obviously, in the playground. But also children, particularly teenagers, they really don't want to be stigmatised. They don't want to be different. So it's no solution whatsoever. We don't feel that Norman Foley has listened to our concerns or the concerns of thousands of parents who've made their voices heard. It seems to me it's very clear now that the Department of Education and Norman Foley is completely captured by this ideology. And that's really what we're facing. You know, we can look at this policy by policy or area of life, which we've done with the Countess, and it's the only way you can kind of start. But now I think it's important that people start to join the dots and realise that we're dealing with full cultural, ideological, institutional capture here. You know, there's a whole cohort of, it seems to me, public servants who believe this is for the greater good. They think this is going to make society better. And that's what we need to deal with, that level of indoctrination at all levels, really.
But because what it seems from the outside is that there was no robust reporting done on the need for this from the ground, like where was the demand from parents, where was the demand from teachers, where was the demand from students that they had to have this in because they were kind of crying out for this. I haven't seen any evidence of that. It seems to be coming from the top down, that this is being imposed upon society for, whatever reason.
Well, when you read any of these policies, like for instance the move to remove single-sex toilets from every school in Ireland, and when you read it closely, you always find the same phrase: international best practice. And for me, that is the footprint of the trans lobby groups and the wider kind of intra-national organisation which are pushing this ideology. But to your point about this didn't come from the ground up, absolutely it didn't. And indeed, none of these so-called trans rights have come from the ground up. Trans-identified people never took to the streets and marched and pushed and had those difficult conversations. Likewise, with the Repeal the 8th campaign, those conversations, which were difficult at times, happened in public. But this ideology, or this change, paradigm shift, has happened behind closed doors. And it really, I think it was put in train in Ireland 20 years ago. And now it's coming home to roost now. Now we're dealing with the impact in everyday life, be it our children being indoctrinated to school, be it our girls losing their right to single-sex spaces, running the gauntlet in mixed-sex toilets, be it women being locked up with male rapists and paedophiles, be it female sport being eradicated, being annihilated. Like, if this continues with female sport, if the category of sex is allowed to be blurred and dissolved in this manner, female sport will no longer exist. There will just be male sport and mediocre male sport, essentially.
And what about people who would typically be seen as safeguard? Those who were safeguarding, particularly children, would be like teachers and principals. you know, obviously we've seen with Enoch Burke, you know, someone who was speaking out, you know, seemed to be, you know, it was not taken kindly. And I mean, I don't know, obviously, what the latest is with that, but it's almost as if there's a chilling factor of, you know, you're not allowed to speak out against this. You know, students have been told, you know, you have to accept this. You're not allowed to speak out. You're not allowed to debate. So there's no debate. There's no discussion. You can't say anything, otherwise you're going to be called names. You might lose your job. And maybe even with the new hate bill that's coming through, the hate speech bill, you could even be put in prison because now they are seen as a protected category. So what on earth can we do?
So just to your point about schools and teachers, you know, in terms of the chilling effect, well, firstly, the Enoch Burke case, I mean, he's lost in this instance, but I presume he will appeal. He would have appealed by now had he been represented by a teachers' union, and no doubt the family will go to Europe in time, but you have to exhaust all remedies in your, you know, domestically before you can do that. But I have actually seen emails that are sent to teachers in classrooms, and what they say is they're cut and paste, they're clearly written by Tenny, and what they say is, this is how you say it to the cohort, and this is what you tell the classmates to do. This is how you present it. And I've seen this, and it's so shocking in the depth of emotional manipulation by the teachers who are trusted and trusted by parents to guide and look after the children. And what it says is things like, you know, I expect you to, from now on, from this point onwards, use the new name, use the new pronouns. And it also says in these emails, you know, once or twice to misgender is okay. After that, it'll be a disciplinary proceeding. It'll be a disciplinary matter. So there's teachers are just caught in this vice-like gripped, you know, whether or not they agree with it or not, they're terrified because they're being threatened with disciplinary proceedings. But not only that, and this is the most chilling thing of all, I've seen an email where it says how to speak to the classmates, because obviously this is their best friend, this is their classmate, this is the person they play with, you know, play football with outside a break, and suddenly they have to pretend it's a boy or a girl, whatever. And so they're told to say to the charges, we know you will be kind. Mm-hmm. We know that you won't add to the distress that X has already gone through. And that is the weaponizing of compassion, children's natural compassion. You know, where are we in society? That's what we're doing to children. And I sound like a nutter, but I have a big issue with the whole be kind slogan, because I think that's where you end up. Why not, you know, be brave?
Be
Why
resilient.
Not stand up? Yeah, exactly.
And obviously there's also cases where children are being socially transitioned in school and their parents are not even aware of it.
Yes, there's a push from the trans lobby groups to encourage teachers to socially transition children. And it's framed as this kind of risk-free, harmless endeavour that you can do, and at least then they're not going to go on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. That is in fact completely not the case. The CAS inquiry in the UK, which is an independent inquiry undertaken by a preeminent consultant paediatrician, and she found that it was actually an incredibly powerful intervention. It's a therapeutic intervention. It should only ever be partaken with, you know, a team, a multidisciplinary team, or under the guidance of a psychologist or a psychotherapist. It has no place in schools, and I would say whether or not parents consent to it is, you know, it's an issue perhaps legally for the school, but social transition has no place in schools. And imagine how the children in that classroom feel when all the adults around them are telling them a lie, and telling them if they don't go along with this lie, they're unkind.
This is kind of the new emperor's new clothes, isn't it? You know, ultimately we're all being told we have to go along with this narrative, and we have to support people because they're so distressed, etc. But actually the distress and damage it's causing to everybody else just seems to be completely and utterly ignored. And
to your point about the hate crime bill, this is precisely one of our concerns with the hate crime bill. So, I mean, I can go through the legal issues, which are just, you know, I mean, they're terrifying, quite frankly. You know, there's no need to, no longer does the state have to prove, you know, you have to prove your own innocence. So the state is it's no longer up to the state to prove you're guilty. You have to prove your innocence. So there's a reversal of the onus of proof. I mean, that is remarkable, even that alone. You wonder, did any of these TDs actually read it? Because that is an extraordinary measure. But also, there's no motivation test. It's motivation and demonstration. It's entirely subjective. So a person from one of these protected groups can say, well, I feel what they said was hate crime, and that's enough. There's no definition of hate, so it can be very much used in terms of our constituency, which is people who are gender critical, but like, let's just call them people who believe in material reality. You know, the 99%.
Biological facts.
Yeah, the 99% of society who maybe don't shout the loudest, let's say, and don't have the ear of government and don't work for NGOs. But there's a lack of symmetry insofar as what can happen now is if I say I don't believe a man can become a woman, I don't believe a child can be trapped in the wrong body, someone who's trans-identified is afforded protected status. So therefore they get to say that's hate speech. But I don't have that afforded to me under law. So there's a lack of symmetry, and therefore it can be used to harass people like me or anyone, any ordinary person. I mean, in the UK, there's been extraordinary cases whereby a woman who was breastfeeding her baby the police came to her door and she was brought in, held for 8 hours. Kate Scotto, you know,
What was she accused of?
Hate speech. So this has already been rolled out in our neighbouring jurisdiction, and I don't know why legislators here are not looking at how badly it's been abused, because police will be used, the Gardaí in Ireland could easily be used to harass gender critical people. And to your point about, you know, maybe someone could end up in prison, that isn't actually really even the point, because it's lawfare, like it's the process is the punishment. You could be dragged, you could have this hanging over your head for like 2.5 years if someone makes it.
And the emotional, trauma from that.
So maybe like someone like you and I will speak up and run the gauntlet, but many people will just silence themselves inwardly. You'll have self-censorship.
Well, I mean, I did read something which said that most TDs had not read it, and also those who had were afraid to speak up against it, which I just think is case in point. You're literally already showing that without that even having been passed, people were self-censoring and people were already going along with basically what it was dictating. I'm
really tired of people going along with this and hoping it'll get better and hoping for the best and this kind of like, it'll be grand. It won't be grand. I'm really here to say it will not be grand. If you look at other jurisdictions, you know, who have taken this path, it could get so much worse. Like there's states in Washington DC just passed this, but the states in Australia where your child can be taken from you and put into care if you refuse to socially transition them or medically transition them.
And one of the things that we had spoken about before was the fact that actually the majority of young people who are seeking this have other issues that they are dealing with, and those are now being ignored. And I think that's really important for people to understand that this isn't just something that just comes out of the blue for these young people. So, for example, girls often, I read something like 90% of the girls seeking this actually were on the spectrum, and something like 80% of the boys, were in fact gay.
So 80% of young people, if they're allowed to go through their normal puberty of their biological sex, will desist. What that means is it was actually a phase, and the NHS have now come out and viewed this and termed this a phase. And we all remember being teenagers. I mean, the job of the adolescent is to cycle in and out of identities, whatever that may be, a goth, a grunger, an emo, and this is just one of those. And of course it's been latched onto by a particular vulnerable cohort. So over 98% of the young people who want to transition, who are seeking transition, will also have, over 98% of them will have comorbidities of things like ADHD, spectrum disorder, self-harming, suicide risk, suicide ideation, sexual abuse. In the Tavistock data, almost half of those children had lost a parent from separation or death. So you're looking at like early childhood adverse events, which of course then, if you are in deep psychic distress and it's offered to you as a silver bullet to all of your issues, or if you're dealing with internalized or latent external homophobia or lesbophobia, wouldn't you take that? And what I view and what makes activists like me angry is the fact that governments, at a government level, it's this kind of box ticking, as in, we won't deal with the actual hard work of structural inequality. We'll just tick the box and make things inclusive. At the actual, at the behest of NGOs who don't even speak for the population and who have no mandate to do what they're doing, but also, it's throwing women and children and the most vulnerable young people under the bus.
And this is a voluntary organisation,
yeah.
And most of the groups that are fighting this are ordinary people,
yeah.
mothers, fathers, you have jobs, you're looking after the house. In terms of the NGOs, they're paid. And this is a paid position. So they've got all the time in the world. They can sit with their finances and the funding that's coming through them to be able to push this through. But it's such a small percentage of the population. So given the fact that we are part of the majority, what can we actually do? Because it seems that our political institutions have been captured.
I have realised from 3 years of doing this is that, there's a whole filtering system around ministers, for instance, where they're not really, there's a team around them whose job it is to keep out, to funnel out anything that isn't the kind of orthodoxy or the official narrative. And so I'm not sure it's useful to keep writing in and saying, if we could just explain this to them, then they would get it, because it's too far gone. TDs are always concerned about what their constituents care about. And if they think this is not a bread and butter issue and it's not coming up on doorsteps, then they're just going to continue on this same path. So we need to ask for a meeting with them and come forward with our objections. At a grassroots level, this is all happening all across Ireland, and we need to take action where and when it's happening, and not just deal with policy that's been drip-fed downwards. So, for instance, on the 1st of June, there's going to be an extraordinary meeting of the LGFA board, where they're going to try and copper fasten this extraordinary policy where they're allowing any boy over 12 to play ladies Gaelic football. So clearly parents should attend that and make their voices heard. I think as well, it's important to remember messaging and optics, because it's so easy to be dismissed by official Ireland in this fight. I mean, the Countess, our organisation, has been called a fringe hate group of transphobes, but you just keep going. You just have to keep going and remember that the majority are behind you. We ran a Red C poll, and it showed that fewer than 1 in 5 people agree with the falsification of birth certs without full genital surgery, and I dare say that figure would be far lower now that people have seen the impacts in everyday life. As an organisation, I'm happy to say that we have been asked to become a stakeholder group in two of our spheres, so prisons and sport, and that was one of our kind of goals internally as an organisation, because all of this has come about with nobody standing up for women and children or young people. And so there has to be, when these decisions are made in the future and policies are pushed through, there has to be someone there who can speak up for that constituency, and that will be us, I hope. And I'm pleased to say we've got inroads in 2 different spheres, but also legislatively. I think it's really important to look at this in terms of laws, and because that's what they did. They created a model law in the UK, and then that was used as an example and a paradigm for the rest of the world. Now, luckily, the UK kind of stepped back from the brink, and they don't have full self-ID, but they have it de facto because of the power of lobby groups in that culture. We have full self-ID. So, but we don't have de facto self-ID, everywhere. But it is creeping in. So we have to stop this. We have to speak up. But in terms of what we can do legislatively, I have drafted an amendment to the Gender Recognition Act, and I'd like to think that it does what needs to be done in the immediate sense, as a matter of emergency, that it gets those men out of prison, that it stops that policy immediately in its tracks, because it unlatches the effect of a gender recognition certificate from prisons and from the equality legislation. Now, people will say, why shouldn't we repeal? Isn't it all a lie? Isn't it all a nonsense? My answer to that is, of course we should repeal, of course we should, but we have to be really clever. They never asked for everything at once. Mm-hmm. They never really showed their hand, and they dressed it up in very clever language, and they were incredibly strategic, and that's what we need to do. We need to chip away at this. The reason they had to be so careful was because what they were trying to change was completely normative and universally accepted. Throughout time and space and all cultures, it was just accepted that you separated men and women in prison, that you separated men and women when people were going to the toilet. So they couldn't come out and say what they really wanted. They couldn't. So likewise, unfortunately, and I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but there's been so much ideological capture in this country that those ideas have become fairly normalised. So to undo them, we have to be as strategic as they were.
Well, I think the starting point is, first of all, for people to realise that we are on the brink, and it's time to do something. So, Laoise de Brún, thank you to you and the organisation, the Countess. I highly recommend everyone goes to your website and downloads documents. There's some incredible work there, and to get behind you and any other organisation that is actually pushing back at this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.